Directly, Bond had started playing maximums. His game had become the centre of interest at the table, and he seemed to be in luck. One or two pilot fish started to swim with the shark. Sitting directly opposite, one of these, whom Bond took to be an American, had shown more than the usual friendliness and pleasure at his share of the winning streak. He had smiled once or twice across the table, and there was something pointed in the way he duplicated Bond's movements, placing his two modest plaques of 10mm exactly opposite Bond's larger ones. When Bond rose, he too pushed back his chair and called cheerfully across the table. "Thanks for the ride. I guess I'll owe you a drink. Will you join me?" Bond had a feeling this might be the CIA man. He knew he was right as they strolled off together towards the bar after Bond had thrown a plaque of 10mm to the croupier and had given a mil to the hussier who drew back his chair. "My name's Felix Leader," said the American. "Glad to meet you." "Mine's Bond. James Bond."
So I wish I was James Bond, just for the day, kissing all the girls, blow the bad guys away, and I wish I was James Bond.
So this week I've been reading Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, which you might remember is the very first James Bond novel. It's an interesting book. Okay, so full disclosure, if you want to read it, it was written in the 50s. It's really sexist and kind of racist. Not hugely so, but enough to make me reread a couple of lines and go, okay, that's not okay. One thing I thought that was interesting about it is Ian Fleming himself was a spy. During World War II, Fleming, along with Roald Dahl, worked for an organisation called the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. And apparently that job was mostly sleeping with people. So Fleming, being a former intelligence officer, a former spy, there's actually quite a few good descriptions. In the first chapter, they lay out exactly what Bond's done to establish his cover. And it feels very accurate. You get the feeling that this is what they do. He also has written Bond as paranoid. I mean, he's a spy. He's got a good reason to be paranoid. He's got so many different markers and tiny little things to make sure none of his room is disturbed, for example. Leading on from that, the first chapter is basically an introduction to James Bond's character. One of the first things we see is him trying to figure out just how he could rob Casino Royale. Not because he wants to, but just, to see if it's possible. So we get this image straight from the first chapter of a guy who kind of thrives on doing really dangerous stuff, slightly self-destructive, maybe a little bit callous. He very matter-of-factly figures out, no, they're not going to risk robbing this place because they have to kill at least 2 people. And the implication isn't these people don't want to kill people, it'd be too much work. And that's, I don't know. Bond isn't a nice person. And I'm not 100% sure whether this book was written in 1953 and I'm reading it now, or whether he's intentionally supposed to be kind of a bastard. The second chapter is kind of where we get all the exposition. And it is presented as a bunch of dossiers that have been given to the head of MI6, M. I don't think they actually call it MI6. I don't know the timeline of the British intelligence services, so I don't know if it's MI6. I'm fairly sure they don't call it MI6 in the book. So essentially, chapter 2 gives us this whole dossier on this is Bond's proposed mission, this is who Le Chiffre is, and this is who SMERSH are. SMERSH was an organisation formed by the Soviet Union, specifically by Joseph Stalin, originally to root out Nazi influence within the Red Army, but later on as an anti-spy network. The version in Casino Royale is apparently very different from the actual organisation that existed, and I think that might just be because Fleming didn't know a lot about it. You rarely do know a lot about secret organisations, to be fair. I quite like Fleming's writing. He's one of the few people who's managed to make a gambling scene actually sound interesting, actually have me turning pages I want to see how this ends. One thing I was particularly impressed with was he still manages to build tension even though there's no reveal. Spoiler alert, Bond gets the 2 cards that will win the game for him across the table, and the first thing Fleming tells us is these are the cards that will let him win. These are the right suit, these are the right number. He will draw these and win. But no one else on the table knows, and it's still tense even though we know it's going to work out okay. And I thought that was, testament to his writing. The other thing I liked was he's not messing about when it comes to gore and violence. We have one scene with a pair of assassins blow themselves up, and there's this fairly awful description without going too into like, oh, his spine was everywhere and his lungs could be seen out of his body. There's this very visceral description of bits of them hanging off the tree and where stuff is around them. It wasn't nice to read. And it also had Bond throwing up after it. I've only seen a couple of Bond movies, but I've always hated him because he's really arrogant and really cocky. And in this, there's a lot of fairly nasty scenes where he's not exactly keen on them. He throws up when he sees a couple of very eviscerated dead bodies. He doesn't make quips or puns about them. He feels more like a human person than he does in the films. But like I said, I've only watched like 2 films and they were Pierce Brosnan ones, so I don't know. That's one of the things about the action scenes in this. They are very quick and very short, and they're also very messy. They're not written or set out in a dramatic fashion. They are single burst of action and then the aftermath. I like that. It keeps the pace up a bit. It's already a short book, but I'm a very slow reader, so that was pretty good for me. Couple of things I'm not keen on. One of them would be a Deus Ex Machina in the middle, where a Smersh agent just shows up to save Bond for some reason. Part of the ending sort of justifies why this agent left Bond alive, but at the same time, the fact this guy showed up in a house in the middle of nowhere first thing in the morning is a bit... I don't know, it kind of brought me out of the story, if I'm honest. That bit is basically the climax, and then the book continues to go on following a plot that isn't as interesting. Like, if you like human drama, you might like it, because it's Bond and Vesper trying to spend a holiday together. But it just drags on and on and on, and that's the point where Bond really started to annoy me. It has this very long monologue about the nature of good and evil, which also has my favourite line. He's been tortured. The villain, Le Chiffre, basically, it wasn't very clear until one character explicitly points it out, but Le Chiffre was basically whipping his dick. And while Bond is going through this long thing about good and evil to another agent, he sort of finishes off with like, well, we can't tell who's good and who's evil. And the other agent just nods and goes, very deep, I'm proud of you. You should be tortured every day. There's quite a few bits of dark humour like that, which made me chuckle. Before I go on to more of the character stuff, which I've got quite a few notes on, there's one speech the villain gives that's very meta, which is basically him saying, this isn't a book, this is real life. It's a bit on the nose, but it is at a very violent and fairly awful scene that you wouldn't have read in any book at the time, I don't think. This was written in 1953. The Cold War was still going on, and still Fleming writes a scene about debating whether good or evil is a thing, or whether it's just people fighting for their country, and what the difference is. So the 2 main characters are James Bond, dickish intelligence officer for MI6. He is a 00 agent, which I think is different from the films. I think in the films, 00 is you have a license to kill, and in the book, 00 agents just have 2 confirmed kills. I'm not 100% sure. It might be the same thing. Like I said, I've only read this book and I've only seen a couple of the films. The other character is Vesper Lynd, who has the best name ever, and unfortunately some of the worst characterization I've ever seen in my life. Vesper's main traits in the book are she has nice boobs, she has a nice bum, and she's fairly incompetent. Nice going, Fleming. To be fair, a lot of her incompetence is made out to be down to her being a rookie and never having had a field assignment, not her being a woman. But Bond keeps going on about it. He keeps going on about how he hates women, how he just sees them as stuff for sex. I think it's just a difference between when a book's being written, because it wouldn't have been nice at the time, but it would probably have been treated as like, oh, that quirky Bond. But now reading it, I felt like, this guy's a dick. I want nothing to do about him. I mean, when he's in the hospital, Vesper sends him flowers, which is really sweet. And he goes on this whole rant about, oh, I hate being surrounded by feminine things. It's annoying. Saying that, there are some scenes with them that are quite nice. Their first, date, they are both a little bit awkward. They both say things and then stop and go, sorry, I didn't mean like that. It felt more like two people talking than some random misogynist wanker. And they do fall in love near the end. Bond does want to marry her. So this is the major spoiler if you haven't read the book and possibly if you haven't seen the film. Vesper turns out to be an enemy spy. She loves Bond a lot and she doesn't want to keep on betraying him, so she commits suicide. It's kind of awful that it takes one of the main characters dying for me to start getting engaged again. It was very near the end of the book. It was basically the last scene. She writes this whole letter to Bond confessing that she's secretly working for the Soviet Union spy agencies. And Bond is very angry. He goes on this rant about how, oh, she has betrayed him. He's furious with her. And then the thing I find interesting is it sets him back on the path he'd gone off. When he's recovering in hospital, he talks about how he doesn't think that the Soviet spies are necessarily evil. He doesn't think Smersh is necessarily evil. I mean, one Smersh agent just saved his life. They can't be that bad, can they? And at the same time, they're probably saying the same thing about him. Good and evil are subjective. And then he gets the letter from Vesper, and after ranting about how she betrayed him, and he's so angry with her, and how could he have fallen for something like that, he makes a vow that he's going to dismantle Smersh. That he's going to take his revenge on them. And the feeling I got from it is that, yeah, Bond doesn't want to admit he fell for this girl, and he feels awful about the situation she was in. She was blackmailed into joining them. They had her lover kidnapped, basically. And they were torturing him and saying, spy on MI6 for us, and we won't kill him just yet. And Bond's reaction is anger at her, but a lot more anger at Smersh for putting her in this situation. But the feeling I got from that was, yeah, this guy's a dick, and he's scared of anything that is remotely not manly in the slightest. So what he's doing, instead of going, oh, I'm so sad for you, is, you know what I'm going to do? Revenge quest. Not for you, for me, revenge quest. If you do feel like reading it, I should probably point out content warnings would be violence, a lot of sexualized language, including a few mentions of rape by the hero, which is absolutely fucking horrible. A lot of sexualized violence. Like I said, Lashif basically does a whole CBT scene to Bond. And there's also some not great language. They describe the villain as having Jewish features. But yeah, anyway, it's actually a pretty enjoyable book. If you want to read it, go ahead, but I don't think it's for everyone. And it's definitely a product of its time, which does not make it particularly palatable for modern readers. Hey, thank you for watching that. If you want to watch more book review stuff I've done, you can click here. This was going to be a post-game reading, but I didn't have any games that particularly fit it well. If you want to watch more of the gaming stuff I've done, that's over here. Great, have a fantastic day, I guess.